Released in 2004, Full Spectrum Warrior was one of the most intriguing yet polarizing games of its time, not just for its gameplay but also for its unique origins. Developed by Pandemic Studios and initially designed as a training tool for the US Army, Full Spectrum Warrior was later adapted for commercial release. While it might look like a typical third-person military shooter on the surface, the game plays very differently, with a heavy emphasis on tactics over direct control or combat. It was ported to the PlayStation 2 by Mass Media Games in 2005, but despite its interesting premise and ties to real-world military training, the game's execution left much to be desired for most players. In this review, we'll explore the development history, gameplay mechanics, and overall experience of Full Spectrum Warrior, focusing on why the game ultimately falls flat despite its unique origins. Full Spectrum Warrior was originally developed as a training simulator for the US Army, called Full Spectrum Command. This simulator was designed to teach soldiers the fundamentals of infantry tactics and squad-based warfare in an urban setting. Its creation was part of a broader movement in the military to utilize video game technology as a way to create immersive and interactive training environments that could complement traditional training exercises. The US Army, in collaboration with Pandemic Studios, worked to create a realistic and challenging simulation that could teach soldiers how to manage multiple squads, assess threats, and develop effective strategies under pressure. The US Army version was a highly detailed, no-frills experience, focusing on tactical planning and execution rather than the more traditional action-heavy elements seen in mainstream video games. Pandemic Studios, recognizing the commercial potential of this software, decided to adapt the game for the public, but in doing so, they retained much of the military realism that had been integral to the original design. The game was published by THQ and released for the Xbox in 2004, before being ported to PlayStation 2 in 2005 by Mass Media Games.
The transition from military training tool to commercial video game is where things get complicated. While the Army version was designed for professional soldiers who already had extensive combat training, the consumer version attempted to make the experience more accessible to the general public, while still maintaining the game's realistic and tactical core. This was a tricky balance to strike, and one that Full Spectrum Warrior arguably failed to achieve. Instead of providing a fun and engaging tactical experience, the game often feels tedious, overly complex, and frustrating to play. This failure may stem from the fact that Full Spectrum Warrior was never intended to be a traditional video game in the first place. Its roots as a military training tool are evident throughout the gameplay, and this focus on realism and tactics over fun and entertainment is likely to have alienated a large portion of the gaming audience. While some players might appreciate the game's attention to detail and its attempt to create a realistic depiction of urban warfare, most are likely to find the experience lacking in excitement or engagement. The PlayStation 2 version of Full Spectrum Warrior was handled by Mass Media Games, a company known for porting several titles to various platforms. Mass Media Games has worked on a number of notable ports, including Jak and Daxter, the precursor legacy for PlayStation 4, and StarCraft 64 for the Nintendo 64. Their work on the Full Spectrum Warrior port was technically proficient, but the limitations of the PlayStation 2 hardware meant that the game suffered from some graphical downgrades compared to the original Xbox version. The environments look dull and barren, and the lighting is murky, filtered through heavy bloom that detracts from the overall visual experience.
The PS2 port plays identically to the Xbox version in terms of gameplay, but this isn't necessarily a good thing. The port does little to address the core gameplay issues that plagued the original release, and if anything, the experience feels even more clunky and frustrating on the PlayStation 2. While Mass Media Games has a solid track record with ports, they were ultimately working with a game that was fundamentally flawed in its design. One of the major problems with Full Spectrum Warrior is its deceptive box art. The cover makes the game look like a conventional third-person shooter, with heavily armed soldiers in dynamic poses suggesting that the player will have direct control over the action. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. In Full Spectrum Warrior, the player has no direct control over individual characters. Instead, you issue commands to squads of soldiers, guiding them from cover to cover, positioning them to suppress enemies, and giving them orders to fire when appropriate. At first glance, the game might seem like a mix of real-time strategy and third-person shooter, something akin to Brothers in Arms or Valkyria Chronicles. However, the comparison falls short. In Brothers in Arms, you still control a character within the squad and have some agency in combat, while Valkyria Chronicles lets you control individual soldiers, allowing for more dynamic and engaging gameplay. Full Spectrum Warrior, by contrast, feels like a tactical simulation first and a game second. There's no free movement over any individual character, and the gameplay feels stilted and restrictive as a result.
The biggest issue with Full Spectrum Warrior is its gameplay, which can only be described as painfully slow and tedious. The process of aiming and shooting is akin to turn-based combat in an RPG. Rather than relying on precision aiming or fast reflexes, the player's skill lies in placing squads in the most advantageous positions to assault enemies. While this is undoubtedly realistic, it makes for a dull and frustrating gaming experience. Each move feels laborious, and the lack of any direct control over combat removes any sense of immediacy or excitement from the game. This style of gameplay might appeal to players looking for the most realistic war simulation possible, but for anyone expecting an action-packed third-person shooter, Full Spectrum Warrior is a massive letdown. The lack of agency in the combat makes it feel more like a tactical puzzle than an engaging war game, and the slow pace and sharp difficulty spikes only add to the frustration. Every action in the game takes longer than it should, and there's little satisfaction to be found in executing even the most successful tactics. In comparison, Valkyria Chronicles offers a similar blend of tactical gameplay and combat, but does so with far more fluidity and player agency. While Valkyria Chronicles allows you to control individual soldiers and rewards quick thinking and precision, Full Spectrum Warrior feels rigid and overly prescriptive. The unique gameplay mechanics might be interesting from a design perspective, but unique doesn't always mean good, and in this case, the result is a game that is often more frustrating than fun.
To make matters worse, Full Spectrum Warrior isn't much to look at either. The environments are barren and lifeless, with little to break up the monotony of the drab, brown urban landscapes. The lighting effects are heavy-handed, with an overuse of bloom that gives the game a murky, washed-out appearance. While the graphics might have been more acceptable on the original Xbox, the PS2 version suffers from noticeable visual downgrades that make the game look even worse. This visual blandness only adds to the overall feeling of tedium. The lack of variety in the environments and the dull, muted color palette make each mission feel like more of the same. There's little sense of progression or excitement as you move from one level to the next, and the game's focus on realism over spectacle results in a visually uninteresting experience. Ultimately, Full Autistic Spectrum Warrior is certainly on some kind of spectrum, that is, the autistic spectrum. It is a game that suffers from its own ambition. Its unique origins as a military training tool are certainly interesting, but this focus on realism and tactics over fun and engagement results in a game that is often slow, frustrating, and dull to play. While it might appeal to players looking for the most realistic war simulation possible, for most gamers, Full Spectrum Warrior is a tedious and unsatisfying experience. Its deceptive box art, clunky gameplay, and dull graphics make it a difficult game to recommend, and even its most unique qualities aren't enough to save it from mediocrity.